And November 24th, 1971, a man in a dark suit and a black clip-on tie handed a flight attendant a note. It said he had a bomb. Within hours, he had $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and the undivided attention of the FBI. Then, somewhere over the wilderness of southwest Washington, in the freezing dark at 10,000 feet, he opened the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 and stepped out into the wind. He was never seen again. For 53 years, D.B. Cooper has been the only unsolved hijacking in American aviation history. Hundreds of suspects, thousands of leads, not one confirmed identity. And then, in the fall of 2025, 2 siblings in North Carolina walked into an outbuilding on their late father's property and found a parachute rig that changed everything. What they found, and who it points to, is not the man most people have spent 50 years arguing about. To understand why this discovery matters, you have to go back to the beginning, because the story of D.B. Cooper was never really one story. It was 2. 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, in April of 1972, a United Airlines flight was hijacked over Utah using almost the exact same method. A man boarded with a fake bomb, demanded cash and parachutes, and jumped from the plane mid-flight. This time, the FBI caught him. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy II, a decorated Army helicopter pilot, a 2-tour Vietnam veteran, a Sunday school teacher, and, at the time, a criminal justice student at Brigham Young University. Investigators noticed the similarities immediately. The method was nearly identical. The skill set matched. McCoy was an experienced skydiver and a trained pilot who understood exactly how a 727 behaved in the air, which was not common knowledge in 1971. But the FBI never charged McCoy for the Cooper hijacking. They already had him on the Utah case, and prosecutors decided that was enough. 2 years later, McCoy escaped from Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary using a fake gun carved from a bar of soap. He was tracked down in Virginia and killed in a shootout with police in 1974, 3 years after Cooper vanished into the night sky. For decades, McCoy sat in the background of Cooper theories, a footnote, one name among hundreds. Other names took center stage instead. There was Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient employee whose family believed for years he was Cooper. There was Dwayne Weber, whose deathbed confession sent his widow searching for answers. There was Lynn Doyle Cooper, L.D. Cooper, whose niece Marla Cooper went public in 2011 convinced her uncle was the hijacker. The FBI tested that lead. In 2011, agents compared DNA from Cooper's family line to the partial genetic material recovered from the hijacker's tie. It didn't match, or at least it didn't match conclusively. The FBI's own forensic team admitted the sample on the tie was degraded, mixed with other people's DNA, and possibly not even Cooper's to begin with. Then there was Robert Rackstraw, a former Army pilot, accused by an amateur investigative team in a widely watched documentary. Rackstraw denied it publicly and threatened legal action. Critics pointed out he was only 28 at the time of the hijacking, younger than most eyewitness descriptions of Cooper, who was pegged as a man in his mid-40s. Each of those theories had a devoted following. Cooper conferences popped up in the Pacific Northwest, drawing amateur investigators who spent their vacations combing riverbanks and swapping decades. Old FBI documents like trading cards, books were written, podcasts were recorded. A cottage industry of true crime obsession grew up around a case that, by any conventional measure, should have gone cold decades earlier. And every single suspect in that lineup shared the same fundamental weakness. None of them could be physically tied to the hijacking itself. No matching DNA. No matching possession. No documented connection to the actual crime scene beyond a family member's suspicion or a resemblance to a police sketch drawn from the memory of frightened passengers 50 years ago. By 2016, the FBI had had enough. After 45 years, thousands of investigative hours, and a case file so large it filled entire rooms, the Bureau officially suspended the DB. Cooper investigation. No conclusion, no confirmation. Just an open question that refused to close. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In late 2025, a name that had been sitting quietly in the corner of Cooper theories for 50 years came roaring back to the center of the story. And this time, the evidence wasn't a theory. It was physical. Richard McCoy II's children, Shantae and Richard III, had grown up knowing their father as a war hero and a loving parent, not as a folk legend hijacker. Their mother had always suspected there was more to the story, but she never spoke about it publicly, and the children respected her silence, even after McCoy was killed, even after the rumors, even after true crime writers came knocking for decades. They waited. It wasn't until after their mother passed away that they felt free to look. What they found in an outbuilding on the family's old North Carolina property was a parachute rig. Not just any rig, one that aviation investigators say had been modified in a way that matched the specific type of parachute issued to Cooper in 1971. Alongside it was something even more damning, a skydiving logbook belonging to McCoy, reportedly documenting jumps in the exact rugged terrain of Oregon and Utah. the same remote corridor where both the Cooper and McCoy hijackings occurred. One investigator who examined the rig called the find 1 in a billion, not because parachutes of that era were rare, but because of how specifically the modifications lined up with what witnesses and forensic reconstructions said Cooper had used. The siblings reached out to Dan Grider, a retired commercial pilot and aviation investigator who had spent years independently researching the Cooper case on his own channel. Grider, in turn, connected the family with the FBI. And this time, the Bureau didn't wave it off the way IT had waved off so many leads before. Agents took possession of the parachute and the logbook. They requested DNA samples from both of McCoy's children. And in a move that signaled just how seriously they were taking it this time, they asked to exhume the body of Richard Floyd McCoy II himself, buried on that same family property for more than 50 years. This is the part of the story where most retellings jump straight to a verdict. This one won't, because the honest answer, as of the most recent reporting, is that the case is still open. The DNA testing is still underway. But to understand why investigators are more confident about McCoy than they've ever been about any other suspect, you need to understand the one piece of evidence that has outlasted every single theory for over 50 years: the tie. When Cooper boarded that plane in 1971, he was wearing a black JCPenney clip-on tie. At some point during the flight, he took it off and left it behind. Whether by accident or on purpose, no one knows. That tie became the single most valuable piece of physical evidence in the entire case, and forensic scientists have been extracting secrets from it for decades. In the 2000s, analysts found something strange embedded in the fabric: more than 100,000 microscopic particles, including unalloyed titanium, along with traces of bismuth and strontium sulfide. These aren't materials you pick up from an ordinary desk job. Titanium in that pure, unalloyed form was, in the early 1970s, almost exclusively used in aerospace manufacturing, specialized metallurgy, and certain chemical or electronics work. High-precision, restricted access industries. Whoever wore that tie had been somewhere very few people had access to. That detail matters enormously when you put it next to McCoy's background. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a helicopter and fixed-wing aviator with military training, someone whose career put him in and around aircraft manufacturing and maintenance environments, the exact kind of setting where those trace particles could transfer onto clothing. It doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's the kind of coincidence that stops looking like a coincidence once you stack it against everything else. The matching hijacking method, the matching skill set, the matching terrain in the logbook, the matching parachute modifications, and now physical evidence recovered directly from his own property by his own children. Think about what it actually takes to match a piece of trace evidence like that. It isn't enough for a suspect to simply have worked around aircraft. The particles found on the tie point to a narrow set of industries active in the early 1970s, and the person wearing that tie would have needed direct, repeated exposure. Not a single visit, but the kind of environment someone works in every day. Cross-reference that narrow list of industries against a suspect who also happens to be an experienced skydiver, who also happens to understand the exact stall speed and rear stair mechanics of a Boeing 727, who also happens to have committed an almost identical crime 5 months later, and the odds of coincidence start collapsing fast. That's the argument investigators are quietly making behind closed doors, even without a finalized DNA result to back it up yet. Investigators are now running that decades-old genetic material from the tie against fresh DNA pulled from McCoy's children and pending the exhumation from McCoy himself. If the profiles align, it would be the first physical DNA link ever established between a named suspect and the original crime scene evidence in the entire 53-year history of the case. Every previous DNA test against L.D. Cooper's family, against other candidates, came back inconclusive or negative. This is the first time the Bureau has pursued testing against a suspect whose forensic profile, method, skill set, and physical evidence all point in the same direction at once. There's a reason this theory is gaining traction in a way none of the others ever did. And it isn't just the parachute, it's the psychology. Every major Cooper suspect before McCoy required you to imagine a stranger, a ghost who appeared once, pulled off an impossible crime, and then vanished from history entirely, never repeating the act, never leaving a second trace. McCoy doesn't require that leap. McCoy already did it again, 5 months after Cooper disappeared into the Washington night. A man used the identical method, fake bomb, cash demand, parachute jump from a moving jet, over Utah. That man was caught almost immediately, in part because he made mistakes a first-timer wouldn't necessarily avoid making twice. Investigators at the time were struck by how closely his technique mirrored Cooper's. The FBI's own retired agents have spent years wondering privately whether they let the real hijacker walk out of custody in 1971 simply because they didn't yet have a reason to connect the two cases. There's a pattern criminologists look for in cases like this. A first offense that's almost too clean, too well planned, followed by a second attempt that gets sloppier because the offender has started to believe the Method actually works. McCoy's Utah hijacking wasn't identical to Cooper's. He was caught within days, partly because investigators finally had a fingerprint to work with, and partly because he'd made contact with people who later testified against him. But sloppier doesn't mean random. It means someone who had already done this once, who knew the mechanics cold, and who got comfortable enough to leave traces. The first attempt never did. If you're building a profile of the kind of person capable of the original Cooper hijacking, someone with military parachute training, detailed knowledge of a 727's rear air stair, the nerve to jump into freezing air at 10,000 feet, and the composure to sit calmly next to a flight crew for hours while making it look easy, McCoy doesn't just fit that profile. He's one of a vanishingly small number of people on record who's demonstrably capable of all of it because he already proved it in a courtroom. Ralph Himmelsbach, the FBI agent who led the original Cooper investigation for years, spent his career convinced the hijacker likely didn't survive the jump, that he vanished not into a new identity, but into the wilderness itself, dead before morning. That theory dominated the case for decades. Reinforced in 1980 when a boy digging on the banks of the Columbia River at Tennebar found a decaying bundle of cash, nearly $6,000 of Cooper's ransom money, disintegrating in the mud. It was treated as proof that the jump had killed him, that the money had simply washed downriver from wherever his body came to rest. But McCoy's survival tells a different story. If McCoy was Cooper, then the Cooper died in the jump theory collapses entirely, because we know as a documented fact that the man behind the near-identical Utah hijacking landed safely, walked away, and lived for 2 more years before his death in a shootout, not a parachute failure. The Tennebar money doesn't have to mean Cooper. Drowned. It could just as easily mean a portion of the ransom was buried, lost, or discarded somewhere along a route McCoy himself designed. A man experienced enough with these jumps to know exactly how to disappear into rough terrain and walk out again. This is also where the not who you think part of the story becomes impossible to ignore. For 50 years, the cultural image of D.B. Cooper has been a kind of American folk anti-hero, a mysterious stranger who beat the system once and vanished into legend, admired at conventions, celebrated in bars named after him, memorialized in an entire subculture of amateur investigators who gather every year just to trade theories. If McCoy is confirmed as Cooper, that image doesn't just get a name attached to it, it gets rewritten entirely. Cooper stops being an untouchable ghost and becomes a man who was arrested, convicted, and killed by police less than 3 years after the crime that made him famous. A man who almost got away with it twice and very nearly a third time, before a jail escape ended in gunfire on a rural Virginia road. There's something almost uncomfortable about that shift. The folk hero version of Cooper only works because he's unknowable. A blank space onto which decades of amateur detectives and true crime enthusiasts could project whatever story I wanted. McCoy isn't a blank space. He's a documented person, with children who are still alive, who loved him, who spent 50 years protecting the truth of who their father was before finally deciding the public deserved to know. Shantae McCoy has said publicly that whether the case is ever officially closed matters less to her than making sure people understand the man behind the name, not an outlaw legend, but someone who was, in her words, still their father, someone they don't excuse but also don't disown. That tension is part of what makes this the most credible break the case has ever had. This isn't a stranger stepping forward. Chasing attention. It's a family that waited 5 decades, through their mother's entire life, before handing over evidence that could permanently attach their father's name to the most famous unsolved crime in American history. So, where does that leave the case right now? As of the most recent reporting, in early 2026, the DNA testing has not produced a public, confirmed announcement from the FBI. The Bureau has not stood in front of a camera and declared the case closed. What has happened is quieter and, in some ways, more significant. Agents took the evidence seriously enough to request an exhumation. They took DNA from McCoy's living children. They kept the investigation active instead of dismissing it the way they dismissed nearly every lead before it. One investigator close to the case put it bluntly. The Bureau's continued silence, rather than a public denial, is itself starting to look like a kind of answer. If the parachute and the logbook didn't fit, agents say, that's usually the point where a lead quietly disappears from the file. This one hasn't. There's also a real possibility the science simply won't cooperate. Shantae McCoy herself has acknowledged that the backpack and parachute canopy sat inside a hot, humid barn for more than 50 years. Conditions that degrade DNA badly, sometimes past the point of any usable comparison at all. It's possible the most promising lead in the history of the Cooper case ends not with a headline, but with a lab report that simply can't say yes or no. But even short of a lab-confirmed match, the case for McCoy has become harder to dismiss than any theory that came before it. Every previous suspect required investigators to explain away at least one major inconsistency. An age that didn't fit, a skill set that didn't line up, a body of evidence that was mostly circumstantial or secondhand. McCoy is the first suspect where the pieces converge instead of conflict. The copycat hijacking months later, the matching parachute modifications recovered from his own property, the logbook placing him in the right terrain, the aerospace-grade particles on the tie aligning with his military aviation background, and now, finally, a direct DNA comparison in progress for the first time in the case's history. It's worth sitting with how unusual that convergence really is. In 53 years, no other name has arrived with physical objects still in existence, a living family willing to hand them over, and a documented second crime that mirrors the first down to the method of escape. Amateur investigators have chased tips based on a stranger's resemblance to a courtroom sketch or a barroom confessional, overheard secondhand. This is different in kind, not just in degree. It's the first time the case has moved from who might it be to here is an object, test it, which is precisely the kind of evidence a 50-year-old cold case almost never produces this late in its life. If that comparison comes back positive, D.B. Cooper stops being America's greatest unsolved mystery and becomes something almost stranger. A solved one, sitting in plain sight for 50 years under a name nobody was looking at closely enough. Not a ghost, not a folk hero who beat the system and disappeared into myth. A man who was arrested for doing the same thing twice, whose children grew up in his shadow without ever knowing the full weight of what he might have done first, and who died in a shootout in Virginia 3 years after making an entire country ask the same question over and over for half a century. Who was he, and where did he go? For 53 years, nobody could answer that. For the first time, someone might finally be close. What do you think? Does the evidence point where investigators think it does, or is this just the latest name in a very long line of near misses? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to go deeper into the original 1971 case file, that's next.